I don't know about you, but I'm finding it harder and harder to be a football fan. It's not that I'm not enjoying the standard of football. The quality of the elite game has probably never been better across the top European divisions. It's just that I feel increasingly disconnected from the whole charade. Every year, elite football feels more oriented around the spectacular. It is a show that I am invited to view from a distance, but one in which I am able to take less and less part. I want to feel like a fan again. I want to be part of a community. I want to feel like I belong. In this episode, I try to get to the heart of the question: does English football need a more active fan culture?
Does English football need a group of fans to sit behind one of the goals and create interesting tifos and sing songs? Not necessarily.
Stevie Green is a writer, editor and podcaster, and a member of Clapton Community Football Club.
But then, does English football need a fan culture of people who are actively engaged in the running of the club and care about the community that is supporting it? Then yes, absolutely.
So you follow Clapton Community Football Club, which is a breakaway from Clapton FC. I think it's probably best for us to start talking about Clapton FC because they're quite famous, or at least infamous. What's the deal with Clapton FC?
Clapton FC were formed in the sort of late 1870s, one of the sort of great non-league football pillars of London, and had players like Walter Tull, who's very famous, playing for them at one point. In 2012, fans started picking up the club and supporting it in a way that wasn't really that common at that sort of level. And then over the last sort of few years, it's sort of fallen on hard times again with poor ownership. It's not a club that I know too much about anymore because it's so far removed from what it was. And obviously with the breakaway club, it's sort of fallen back into not obscurity, but people don't follow it anymore.
These are the Clapton Ultras, some of the most passionate and active supporters in England, and the lifeblood of Clapton FC.
No pyro, no party! No pyro, no party!
One of the big things about 2012 was that the Clapton Ultras formed with the purpose of, quote, following the European Ultras tradition and developing around local fans disengaged with modern professional football, migrants to East London, and those with an opposition to discrimination and far-right politics, end quote. Talk to us a little bit about this quote-unquote European Ultras tradition that was important at Clapton. How did it emerge and what did it look like?
I don't really know how it started because I wasn't there at the time. I think there's a few people who probably were, and they've seen the way that it looks change ever so slightly over the years. The Clapton Ultras are sort of splintered into two things now. So you've got the Brigada Ultras Clapton, which is the BUC, and people who might still identify themselves as the Scaffold Ultras, who are the people that sort of take over the one stand at the Old Spotted Dog and now the Stray Dog. So you've got sort of two different factions of it now who do different things, a lot of the same things, but agenda's not a word I want to use, but they do have their own agendas. And I think it was an opportunity really at the time when football really was becoming hyper-capitalist and really stepping on the overdrive pedal with that it allowed people to sort of move into a space that wasn't occupied at a lower level and really sort of throw themselves into the club and take on the causes that they cared about and adapt it at that sort of local level.
So what does it look like being a Clapton Ultra?
Well, I wouldn't really class myself as an ultra. I've been involved with CFC for, about 2 years. I went to go and see old Clapton a couple of times over the sort of 11 years I've been in London. Well, the last year I've been more involved with the coaching of the Young Tons, which is one of the youth teams that we've got. And I'm on the comms committee for the women's team. So I wouldn't actually class myself as an ultra in that sort of broad sense of I'm not standing there with a flag and a megaphone on a match day. But, you know, I do sort of deeply care about the charities that we partner with. It's very rare that I actually get to watch a game as a fan anymore. So I'm probably about as far from an ultra as you could be in that classic sense.
So what do the Ultras get up to at Clapton then? What does their political engagement look like? What does their match day experience look like?
Well, we'll get there a bit early before kick-off and we'll put the flags up. So considering we are such a small grassroots club, we do have a global fan base and we live stream a lot of the games, and there's a lot of photographers who will come by and take pictures. So it's important that we have our messaging placed predominantly on the sidelines. It's something that everybody who comes to the games gets behind, and, you know, whether they bring their own stuff, that's cool, or whether they just sort of get behind wearing their shirts, making noise, or just watching the game and having some drinks with their friends. It's completely up to you how involved you are with that side of things, you know, your own fandom. You've got people like the BUC, though, who are great because they'll come and they'll make just endless amounts of noise, and it is a constant stream of it for 90 minutes, regardless of the score, regardless of the weather. But they are sort of like their own entity. So they are slightly separate to the people in the scaffold, and it sometimes doesn't always equate in terms of the running of the club. But, you know, we're all there for the right reasons, and we're all there for, by and large, the same reason.
And what does the activism look like that Clapton Community FC are engaged in? Like, obviously that will be done through the fans as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of direct action with that. So we've got the Clapton Hardship Fund, which was set up at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, and that's money that has been gathered from donations that people who've either lost their jobs or have fallen on hard times or just generally struggling can take some of that money and improve their circumstances. But then there's sort of like 14 charities on the website that we work with directly or indirectly, and we always sort of welcome that presence at a match day, and we always use our internal and external comms to highlight what these charities do. And, you know, we're just sort of actively trying to engage more with the local community, because at the moment the club is based in Walthamstow and we're in the process of moving back to Forest Gate. So there's two very different separate communities there that we are trying to engage and sort of see how we can help them, as well as sort of getting more supporters through the door.
Priced out of league football, they've been instrumental in social campaigns ran under the Clapton Ultras banner.
Refugees are welcome here. Say it loud, say it clear. Refugees are welcome here.
In terms of the activism side of things at Clapton Community, to what extent would you say that people who go in as ultras realise that there is that activism side to it? How many people are just sort of straight up and down ultras who are there for the football, and how much of it sort of bleeds over into that activism side?
Hard to say, really, because I think, you know, there's people who will go who aren't necessarily going to go and be visible with their activism, and that's fine. I think there's people who do things in their own time and away from the club that they will bring with them, and that's great, because at the end of the day there is no rule book for how an ultra or a fan of this club needs to behave, other than, you know, don't be racist, sexist, homophobic, or a general knob. You're allowed to sort of express yourself in whichever way you see fit. It's not necessarily always political. Sometimes it is just about supporting those 11 people on the pitch. But I think, you know, being associated with Clapton, everybody knows now that there is that political edge to it, and that's absolutely fine.
Just moving on from that political edge, obviously there's a clear association of football and politics at Clapton Community, regardless of how involved you are or aren't as an ultra. As time goes by, as you followed Clapton Community, would you say that you feel as though people are becoming more or less amenable to the idea of sports being political?
Yeah, I think definitely more amenable to it. I think if you look at the sort of current landscape of not just football, but professional sports, particularly basketball, where its sort of political statement is almost actively encouraged, I think you'll always have people who don't like that and do want to keep it separate. but I don't think you can. Even just recently, over the weekend, there was Newcastle fans who raised, I think it was about £15,000 for a local food bank instead of paying the pay-per-view fee that the Premier League want, which in itself is a political act. So I think it doesn't always have to be showy. I don't think it always has to be performative. I think it can be really low-key. And in a lot of instances, people might not even recognise it as a political act. But I think that the two are so intrinsically linked that you can't really escape it now. And I think with the way that the world is, and particularly the way that the UK is, we probably will see a lot more of that because sport does provide the platform.
Clapton Community are in the Middlesex County League, and the ultra cultures around Clapton have always been consciously reactive against what they call modern football. Does that mean that Ultrafandom becomes more complexified the higher up the pyramid you go? I mean, could you have a Manchester United Ultras, for example?
If you think about someone like Manchester United, you could argue that they did have a set of ultras who then did what we did at Clapton and broke away and formed FC United. I think the more interesting question is, can you have Grimsby Town Ultras? Can you have Ipswich Town Ultras? I think with the sort of top-end clubs like Man United and Liverpool, when fans are allowed in the stadiums, you've got a lot of people who will go there for a day out, and it's an experience. You know, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but you can't build a base on that. It's not sustainable in that way. These sort of fan groups in the UK have formed through dissolution and through being disenchanted with the way that their own club is run. And, you know, I think a lot of us at Clapton, we all have professional teams that we support and follow and like. But the chances of being involved at a club, you know, like Aston Villa, say, who I support, can I have a say in how things are run there? Like, absolutely not. But at Clapton, my voice counts for something, and I can put my vote to use and run things that way because, you know, if you are a Clapton member, you're an owner, and we're all owners. And that's what's great about the club, and everything is democratic. It's not like it is in places like Germany where you've got the sort of 51-49 rule. So there is that blockage, if you like, of being involved at that top level.
In the end, it went like it did, and it's a horror show. This should not happen in the modern game with the amount of money that is about. But this project now should not be driven by Manchester United and Liverpool. This should be driven by the FA.
Modern football's probably never been more negatively viewed in Britain as it is at the present time. You've already mentioned the pay-per-view. Can we call it a scandal? I guess we can call it a scandal. And Project Big Picture, rising ticket prices, there's a growing disconnect between clubs and communities. Do you think there's ever been a more fertile context for ultra outfits to form?
No, this is probably a really great time for it. And it's not just Clapton as well. There's places like Dulwich Hamlet and Eastbourne Town. And I'm sure there are clubs like this dotted all over the country. Clapton is particularly famous for being one of the first to do it in the UK. But, you know, you'll go to any sort of non-league ground these days and you'll watch a game and there will be a sort of dedicated group of fans who will make themselves known one way or another. Without even speaking to them, you know that this is a group of people who obviously care about this club, what it means to the community. And then it's just a case of finding out how that fandom relates to the club, to the community. And I think, you know, with the way football is going and the greed that is involved at the top level, you will find more people just walking away from it and being able to get involved at a lower league game, because you can take a six-pack of cans into the stand and you can chat rubbish with your mates and sing and shout and do all these things and stand up and, you know, do all these things you get told off for in an actual stadium. And, you know, with the numbers that are involved these days and how welcoming club committees are to new volunteers, it's only going to grow, and it's going to grow quite quickly.
So do you think we'll ever see a more widespread culture of ultra fandom in the UK then?
I think so. The word ultra is so open to interpretation though, isn't it? Because is it a group of people who just go and make noise and wave flags around, or is it a group of people who do that and also do community work, or is it just people who do community work and keep the club thriving and growing? I think all three are open for growth, some more than others. But I think, like we said earlier, it's a really good time for it. And with the way that professional football is going, particularly now with fans not being able to get into the stadiums at these sort of lower levels, you can get in and you can have a really great Saturday. I think it's completely dependent on how much the individual wants to be involved, but that fertile ground is there.
Are you a fan of football today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. But although the UK seems ripe for a surge in fan activism, it's hard to escape from the idea that active fandom is simply just not British. To find out more about why this might be the case, I spoke to Mark Deutsch, a Principal Research Fellow at the University of Brighton. Academically, Mark's writing focuses on the sociology of European football fan cultures, but he also has a direct experience of Ultras culture as a fan of Whitehawk FC.
I would argue that we sort of had in Europe two types of fandom. Italian style, which is ultra style, and English style, which lends itself to sort of hooliganism, but also a much more organic approach. There's elements of ultras in Britain, but not so much.
So you're someone who's looked at fan culture from within an academic setting. Obviously, to do that, there needs to be some sort of sense of clarity about the terms of the debate. So how do you go about defining ultra culture as an academic?
That's a $64,000 question there, John. What is culture? I mean, culture is something that changes. It's not fixed. It's often sort of seen as something that is a permanent structure that affects people and people will conform to, but we often just pick up different things. We have different influences, we have friends from different parts of the world, or we travel and we see things and we pick them up. So what we can talk about with Ultras culture is how Ultras started in Italy in the 1960s, a very politically fertile time. It sort of spread around the Mediterranean, particularly in the 80s and 90s, 80s in particular, with international competitions like Italian fans going to Spain in 82 and France in 84 for the European Championships. Then TV picked up Serie A in the 1990s, which is where I sort of fell in love with Italian football and also the fans. And then that's picked up in the 90s and 2000s in places like Germany, Poland, etc. Now it's sort of spread with social media to places like Japan, Indonesia, North Africa. So we just pick up these things and we start to put into play some of the elements of what you might term as Ultras culture.
So how would you define Ultras then?
Ultras are a passionate group of fans who absolutely are devoted to their club and the symbols of their club, and it structures their entire sort of relationships, their friendships, their daily activities. And Ultras go above and beyond, and that's what they do with their fandom. When we're talking about different cultures, there's lots of different elements, but what we can say, there's a certain performative aspect of Ultras. So singing, clapping, jumping up and down. Big choreographies, maybe on banners, wearing similar sort of clothing, so to create a visual image. Pyrotechnics is also a big one. So different places have different aspects of this, but part of it is this collective identity that is designed to intimidate, designed to show solidarity and uniformity, and basically to showcase the club as this passionate fans, passionate and superior to others, both on and off the pitch.
So why would you say that sort of culture isn't very widespread in the UK?
Well, partly because English fandom sort of developed very differently. So as I said earlier, ultras originated in a particularly politically fertile time in the 1960s and 70s in Italy. But at the same time in England, what was happening is that you started to get new forms of social identity and sort of consumer behaviour. So you had like mods and rockers, and you had hippies, and you had those sort of subcultures emerging. These also found their way into football. Also started to emerge with hooliganism and a certain sense of masculine identity around, again, defending space and defending territory, which really took off in the 1980s, I think is well documented. So what was happening in England was vastly different from what was happening in Italy. But English hooligans did go to Europe. So they went to Spain 82 and got into fights, which sort of led to an influence of English culture there, hooligan culture, the same as in France, in the Netherlands, Germany, etc. Now, what we're seeing is that ultras culture has sort of picked up on some of those hooligan elements. So maybe there's types of clothing, Stone Island, for example, or sort of certain aspects of English hooligan culture and just incorporated it into ultras culture. But English fan culture is more organic. So ultras have a capo, someone who is going to lead the chants.
Arancio Verdi siamo noi! Arancio Verdi siamo noi! E chi cazzo siete voi? E chi cazzo siete voi? Noi dell'Unione siamo qua! Noi dell'Unione siamo qua! E per voi non c'è pietà! E per voi non c'è pietà!
We don't really have that in England. Often it's different people will start a song. And I think one of the biggest factors of why it's been hard in England, particularly in the last 25 years, is we now have all-seater stadiums. It's harder for the singers to congregate together, and we don't have that same opportunity to create that atmosphere collectively because we might have different people who are just there for the day, tourists, or people who are season ticket holders who aren't interested in that, but they happen to have their seat in that particular area.
The causation here is interesting to me because it seems as though ultra-fandom is emerging from out of political or sociological conditions. I guess if we move to the present day, and present-day UK in particular, do you think that modern football is moving to a point where the conditions are ripe for the emergence of a more active football fandom?
I hope so, but I think we've got to understand what we mean by politics here, because although the original ultras in Italy emerged in a particular political moment. The years have led to this political terrorism. There was far left and far right terrorism in Italy in the 1970s. And often those political protests took the paraphernalia of the protest into the stadium, so the flags, the banners, so the ultras themselves were political. But by the 80s, the influence of English hooliganism, some of those groups fragmented, or new younger groups emerged who were more interested in fighting anyway. So to a certain extent, they've become less ideologically political, so left and right, but they're still political in the sense that they are concerned about football politics. By this I mean regulations on their behaviour, ticket prices, whether you're allowed to have pyrotechnics in a stadium or whether the police are controlling stadiums, etc., etc. So those aspects are all politics, and they're all linked to sort of policy and politics, but they are explicitly tied to the politics of football and how football is run. So they are engaged. Now, how this differs in England is that fans have been political. From the 1990s, you had the emergence of Independent Supporters Association, partly in response to the formation of the Premier League, but also partly in response to the post-Taylor report after Hillsborough, which was about bringing in all-seater stadiums, about changes in how the police operated, bringing in stewards, etc., etc. So you had a massive economic transformation then, and fans in England tended to respond to that by forming independent support associations to voice their concerns, again, around the football politics. So it sort of emerged slightly differently, whereas the ultras in Italy and elsewhere have maybe been more radical and more direct in action and more vocal in some of the issues that they express. They aren't necessarily engaged in the mechanisms of changing policy in the same way that the English fans are, but equally the English fans are not necessarily challenging the structures in the same way. They're more about polishing the edges to make it a little bit more bearable. So we have a very interesting moment in Britain and in elsewhere, and they're all politically engaged. They're just doing it in very different ways.
So how would you say that an increased ultra culture going forward in the UK would change football? Do you think there's much of a correlation between the prevalence of ultras and more egalitarianism within the football pyramid?
There is some ultras culture emerging in the lower leagues in England. I'm a fan of Whitehawk, and we have the Whitehawk Ultras, but they sort of do it slightly ironically. We've brought in certain aspects of European fan culture there with stickers and also some of the songs we sing. And it is a little bit more collective, but it's still sort of quintessentially British, as anyone can start a song and we join in, much like you would on a terrace anywhere else. So elements are coming in, and they're coming in at a grassroots level where potentially we can have more say, but equally some of the ultras culture that we're seeing in England tends to be maybe seen associated with ideological politics of the left, and particularly around things that might be associated with that, like anti-racism, for example. But actually, that's not necessarily what ultras culture is elsewhere. If you look at the British media in particular, they would suggest that ultras in other countries are all right-wing, racist and hooligans, which isn't true either. Some of them will be, and even in clubs where that is predominant, there will be other ultras groups within the terrace that is maybe apolitical or even maybe have different politics. So just suggesting that we're going to have ultras coming in and they're going to fight for progressive politics isn't necessarily the case. It's maybe more of how do we bring in some of these performative elements and maybe engage a little bit politically and sort of a bit more directly about some of the issues affecting the game.
How do you think the clubs would push back if this sort of ultras culture emerged in English football?
I think it depends on how clubs engage with their fans, full stop. A lot of owners and clubs around the world don't really engage with their fans very well anyway. They treat them as consumers or they treat them as problems. What needs to happen is a proper process of fan engagement in football, and if ultras emerging in Britain engages that and challenges that, then that's a good thing. But the lower leagues, you're always going to have more power because there's more of you and they're more reliant on you coming through the gates. At a big club like Man United or Liverpool or Arsenal or Chelsea, they might just go, well, actually, we don't really want these. They create a problem. And they're probably listening to people from the media who will be saying they're all violent thugs. And actually, what they can be doing is bringing in some really great atmospheres and great imagery. And I think one of the better examples at the higher levels is the Holmesdale crew at Crystal Palace. They're bringing in some of that ultras culture, the songs, the uniformity, maybe even the banners and things as well. That can actually make stadiums feel more alive, which if anyone's watching football during the lockdown will see that it's very empty without fans, and football needs fans because they realise the fans add something to the game and they're trying to pipe in artificial sound and atmosphere and it doesn't work. It's almost in the club's interest to have that. However, the key thing is that it comes from the fans, because fans are not stupid. We can see when the clubs are trying to manufacture something for the television. If they start trying to manufacture ultras culture, then I think a lot of fans will just reject it.
And you mentioned, obviously, a lot of British fandom can be traced back to the Hillsborough disaster, that sort of moment, and the government's involvement with fan culture at that point. How do you think the government would react now if we saw a growing ultras culture in the UK right now?
Well, I think we might see the government operating in much the same way it would do about any sort of participatory grassroots politics, which is try to close it down. We're seeing this with other movements. It tends to get discredited in the media. They'll be identified, labelled as problematic, and therefore, I'm doing air quotes, but right-thinking people should avoid it. As we're seeing this with other particular moments like Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion, for example. And I think this would be put into the same bracket, is it would be seen as fans being a problem. However, both the main political parties put in their manifestos about fan engagement. We've seen recently with the new proposals that were leaked and discussed around the future of English football, that actually all of that was done behind the scenes without fans involved. And as soon as fans did find out, there was quite a significant kickback. So that's what needs to happen. And I can't see that happening anytime soon, despite the political party saying they should do. And I think what should be done is more like the German approach, which is fans are actual members who have a say and a vote, and therefore are part and parcel of the process which means that you're actually going to get a more engaged fan base anyway, and a more active fan base, irrespective of whether they are ultras or not.
So do you think that English football would benefit from the introduction of ultras culture?
Well, I love ultras, and I love the colour and the noise and the atmosphere that they bring. I personally fell in love with football again by going to watch Whitehawk and non-league, where you can have a great atmosphere, great people, and it sort of reminded me of why I fell in love with football in the first place, way back in the 80s, watching Plymouth Argyle. And I feel that a lot of the stadiums have become sort of quite hygienic and clean and empty of atmosphere, and ultras can add some colour to that, and some noise and some pageantry. We have to work with fans to stop the negative stuff, the racism, for example, but there's elements of it that is absolutely amazing, that is really progressive. It's a form of collective behaviour in a world that is increasingly selfish and individualistic. Ultras raise money for charity, they do things to help their communities, and I think that's really important, and that can add something to not just the football club but the communities around it, and I think after COVID we'll need that more than ever.
Stevie Green is a writer, editor and podcaster, and a member of Clapton Community Football Club. Mark Deutsch is a Principal Research Fellow at the University of Brighton and focuses on the sociology of European football fan cultures. He is also a supporter of Whitehawk FC. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons licence by Blue Dot Sessions, and the details of the individual songs can be found in the show notes. This episode was produced by myself and Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.